What does the process of grieving look like? Hint, it's probably not stages. Welcome to Finding Words in Hard Times, the podcast, where we provide stories and tools to help you be more comfortable as you help others in hard times. I'm John Swanson, writer, teacher, and hospital chaplain. And today's episode is available in audio, but I'll be using some slides, so it's also going to be available on the YouTube channel. And you'll find links below for how to get a hold of the video. In the last episode of this podcast, I talked about some research that I did to figure out what helped, what people found helpful, and I'll link to that below as well. But at the same time I was working on that survey, in my literature review, I found reference to a newish model of coping with bereavement, which sounded intriguing, called the dual process model of coping with bereavement. Now, models matter. Pictures that we have of how things work matter significantly. In order to know what to say or do, it helps to have a picture of what's happening. And having a clear picture of what's happening in a situation can help us figure out how to approach that situation. So let's think about Jeremy for a second. Jeremy is a friend. You haven't talked to him in a few months. His wife died a few months ago. You saw him just after the holidays, and you asked him how it was going. I know I'm supposed to be accepting now, is what he said, but I'm not. I'm angry. And you realize that the stages of grief model may be claiming another victim. He expected to be like the model said, and he's not. And so he's blaming himself, not this picture that we have. You want to be helpful. You have a little bit of time. So you start asking him what he's thinking about. And he says, I just keep thinking about our last conversation, what I wished we'd said. Man, I just missed that last breath that she took. I had to figure out the life insurance stuff. She handled all of that stuff. Man, if only we had talked more about it. I haven't looked at any of the resources that the chaplain gave at the hospital, but I don't really want to remember that night, but I'm sure they might be helpful. Sorry, I feel like I'm bouncing all over the place. Getting groceries is really hard. But now I know where the salad stuff is, and I don't cry as often when I walk past the flower section. Maybe I should look at that grief material. You know, I know that I should go to the cemetery. So, how are you doing? Finally, he stops to take a drink of coffee. Half of your brain wants to say, pull yourself together. Some of you that are listening may be thinking about what you would prescribe for him. Some of you are thinking about platitudes to share. Some of you are thinking about how familiar this sounds in your own thinking. So you keep listening to Jeremy, and you start noticing a pattern as he's talking. Some of the comments relate to the loss. Some of the comments are relating to living right now. Some of the comments are about how hard it is to think. Some of the comments are about shutting down. Some of the comments are about feeling stuck. And clearly, this is not about the stages of grief model that we have and are so familiar with. But what is happening? A few years ago, Stroebe and Schut and others noticed these patterns, and they proposed what they're calling the dual process model of coping with bereavement. And I want to give an overview of that model and then talk about how it might be helpful to us. So let's start about what we noticed about Jeremy. Part of the time, he was talking about the loss. Part of the time, he was talking about living now. And so the dual process model talks about two kinds of tasks. So if you can't see the screen, imagine two large ovals, one on the left and one on the right. And on the one on the left, right at the top, it says loss-oriented tasks, and the one on the right, it says restoration-oriented tasks. Stroebe and Schut suggest two kinds of stresses and two kinds of tasks. So there's loss-oriented stressors, which are stressors that are related particularly to the loss, things that we have to resolve related to that. And then there are stressors related to life now, things that we have to learn, what they call restoration-oriented stressors. Um, so let's take a look at the loss-oriented stressors first. Where Jeremy was saying, I keep thinking about our last conversation, what I wish I'd said. I just missed the last breath. I know I should go to the cemetery. Sometimes I turn and realize that she's not there. All of those relate to specifically the loss, the death. In the model, Stroebe and Schut talk about 4 tasks in loss, part of what other people have talked about grief work as grief work. So they talk about accepting the reality of the loss, experiencing and sharing the pain of grief, adjusting to life without the deceased, and relocation of the deceased, which is understanding that wherever they are isn't here. And the things that he was saying, it was clear that Jeremy is working on these tasks, which is to be expected. These are the things that come to mind first when we're thinking about loss. Doing this grief work, this processing, this learning, because it really is a learning thing, is hard, and it takes time, like any learning does. And there are ideas and skills that we can acquire. There's counseling that can be present, but there aren't any shortcuts through this process. But Jeremy isn't just experiencing the loss, he's also trying to bring sense to life now. And this is what Stroebe and Schut call restoration-oriented coping. It's living in the presence or living in the absence of the person who's not here. This isn't what we talk about as moving on, of course, because he's constantly aware of the person who is not there. But there are activities of daily life and activities of occasional living that he has to think about, that he has to be concerned about, that actually cause stress as well. So go back to what Jeremy said, had to figure out the life insurance stuff. She handled all of that. Getting groceries is hard, but now I know where the salad stuff is, and I don't cry as often when walking past the flowers. I finally looked at the resources the chaplain gave as Jeremy is dealing with this side of life. It's accepting the reality of the world, the changed world. To be honest, it's taking time off from the pain of grief. It's mastering the changed environment. It's developing new roles and identities and relationships, not replacements, but new roles. For example, if Jeremy did not do the grocery shopping before, and now Jeremy is doing the grocery shopping, he's getting to know new people. He's getting to connect with a new set of people. And that's part of this process of restoration. So the model tells us that there's these 2 things going on, that we are coping with the loss, and we're dealing with the stress of the loss, and we're coping with the new life, restoration. Particularly in naming this second process and including it in bereavement, we get a better way to make sense of what's going on in our lives. Now, what we know from Jeremy and what we know from our own lives is that there is this process of bouncing back and forth. What Jeremy said is he named it right in what he was saying. Sorry, I feel like I'm bouncing all over the place. We move from loss-oriented to restoration-oriented tasks, and we move from restoration-oriented tasks to loss-oriented tasks all the time. You go to the grocery store, but you get lost in remembering all the times that you went together, and you just stop in tears, or you spend time regretting what you didn't do. You avoid thinking about those last days by plunging into staying out of the house and staying busy, but then you have to go back home. So there's this bouncing back and forth. And what's important to notice is sometimes this oscillation is a way of dealing with or not having to deal with one or the other kind of stress. So, um, because you don't want to deal with um, that grief of the loss and thinking about that all the time, you are busy elsewhere. Or because you don't want to deal with all of the busyness, you sit in a quiet room reflecting on your loved one. Now, sometimes it feels like there's too much going on, and that you just stop and shut down. There's not any coping on either side. It's what Stroebe and Schut described as overload. And people can get, hate to say stuck, but people can get caught in rumination, which is those looping kinds of thoughts that we have, particularly on the loss-oriented time. So we are thinking about, if only I would have been there on time, if only this would have happened, if only I would have, it's my fault, it's my fault. So that kind of looping is what they talk about as rumination. Now, across time, people learn to cope with both loss and restoration. There isn't as much stress, so perhaps learning or perhaps new habits are forming as the person hasn't having to think so much about errands. Um, it's a process of learning, acquiring new skills, learning where to avoid, learning what to think about, learning how to do things. Across time, stressors can reemerge. We often talk about them as triggers. I was talking with a friend recently who, 40 years after his mom died, was having some sadness and struggle. Now, his dad's current health scare was bringing back some stories, but also the accumulation of kid-in-laws and grandkids is this reminder that they aren't, or that she's not here to share them, for him to share with her. And so as we move into new spaces and into new life stages, it's possible for us to need to go back and think through the loss side of the equation as well. And none of that stuff really is so much a stage, right? It doesn't fit into that acceptance, blah, blah, blah. And it's not as much of a wave. It's more of identity formation. It's a learning process as we're including these things into who we are um, in our lives as human beings. So loss, restoration, oscillation, overload, rumination, and the idea of a process. So what do we see with this model? How does this model help us to be more helpful? Since that's the point of this podcast, and it's the point of much of the work that I'm doing. So first of all, this model describes at a granular level what we hear all the time. Those of us who have been in the room when a person has died have seen this oscillation. Those of us who have seen somebody like Jeremy after not having talked to them for a while hear this same oscillation of the two different kinds of the tasks and bouncing back and forth and feeling like it's awful. For me, almost any time I'm with somebody, because as a hospital chaplain, I am, almost any time I'm with somebody after a death, I hear this bouncing back and forth. What are we going to do now? And grief about what just happened and conversation about what just happened. So second, it shows that there is a process, that coping in bereavement is a learning process, which is helpful in a couple of ways. Number one, to let us know that bereavement is ongoing and that it never ends. We are always experiencing losses. And this identity formation isn't done, and that's fine. Also, when we forget that there are these loss and restoration oriented tasks going on and this oscillation, we can stop moving into solving problems, and we can listen to what's going on. Oftentimes when someone says, "What am I going to do?" we start to answer that, and we start to tell them 6 things that they could do. And meanwhile, they don't want an answer. They're expressing this lost identity and are working on who they will be. And then, rather than trying to fix this oscillation, we can see it as a part of the process, not that there's something wrong that needs to be solved. But losing a loved one and being in the process of grieving involves loss stressors and restoration stressors and this oscillation process. Third, it allows for individual differences in the same way that we see individual differences in other parts of our lives. We see individual differences that need to be taken into account in the grieving process. Applies in a couple of ways. One, for example, a friend of yours may say, "You need to get out more." An introvert will have a very different response to that statement than an extrovert would. Because if an extrovert is the one who helped the introvert get out and be around people or avoid being around people, as soon as you say, "Oh, you should get out more," the person is dealing with the grief, and they're reminded of how their loved one helped them with this, and you're increasing the social anxiety of the person that you're talking to. Um, I've been helped in thinking about individual differences with Gretchen Rubin's idea of 4 tendencies, which I will talk about sometime later in one of these podcasts, but I'm not going to do that right now. The fourth thing, the newest version of this model of coping, the dual process model, includes individuals and families, uh, which helps us understand that as individuals are dealing with a loss, a family group may be dealing with a loss as well, and dealing with these loss-oriented tasks and restoration-oriented tasks as well. So, for example, at the holidays, and I've talked about this in some of the work that I've done in making suggestions about holidays. At the holidays, if the person who died is the one who had a particular tradition that they performed, the family system has to figure out who's going to perform that tradition, whether it's setting up a tree or whether it's being the one that starts the arguments all the time. Either way, there's still the what's that person going to do? The other advantage of understanding the idea of individual differences and family differences is this. Lots of times, 2 people who lost a loved one will have this sense of, "You're not grieving as much as I'm grieving." But understanding that there are these 2 processes going on says that while one person is dealing with the loss, the other person may be working on restoration tasks. And then they may switch because of this idea of oscillation. And so what it looks like for one person is, you're not grieving the same way I'm grieving. You're not thinking about our loved one regularly. And somebody else is saying, this is the stuff that needs to get done. We need to move to taking care of this service. We need to move to being taking care of these financial arrangements. We need to move to. So there's that kind of bouncing back and forth that happens. And knowing this allows us to not get so frustrated at comparative grief because it's different tasks. And then fifth, we can help with particular kinds of stressors. And I want to go back to some of the research that I talked about last week. On the loss-oriented side, Saying things like, "This is hard," gives validation to people. Being present with people while they're remembering and telling those stories can be a really helpful thing on the loss-oriented side. Even that acknowledgement of, "I'm sorry about your loss. Can you tell me more about your loved one?" is part of that loss-oriented task kinds of things. And then on the restoration-oriented side, um, what we do as chaplains, which is to say to people, at some point, you're going to have to decide about a funeral home, and we're the ones that you talk to about that. That ends up being a really helpful thing for people. That idea, orientation, presence can fit here, bringing food and having food together, uh, going with somebody for planning a funeral, going with somebody to make arrangements, going with somebody to mow the lawn. All of those relate to these restoration-oriented tasks. And then also on the oscillation, once we understand that that's what's going on, we can help normalize that sense of confusion and overwhelm that people are experiencing. When somebody says, "Oh, I can't figure out why I can't think," we're able to say, "You know what? Your brain's occupied with a whole lot of stuff, a couple of different things. And it's normal to do that bouncing back and forth." And that ability to normalize is huge. So now what? Just some observations as I wrap up on how this model is helpful to me. Um, I better understand my own life and my own grief and adaptation. Um, Perhaps as I've been talking, what you've been thinking is, "Oh, that's what's going on with me." Well, it's helpful to me to think through, "Oh, that's what's going on with me." As I have this model, it gives me a clearer picture of what's going on. Um, when I'm with families, I don't argue or answer nearly as much as I listen. And I wait for them to finish talking before I try to solve a problem, because what's happening is their own minds, their own processing is working through these two models, and I need to leave space for that. Third, I invite storytelling much more with coworkers as well as with patient families. Talk about what's going on. Um, Tell me the story of your loved one. Tell me the stories of what's next. Can help in both sides of this process. I suggest to try this more than I say do this, because there's not specific answers of how to move through um, both sides of um, these processes. They're descriptive, not prescriptive. They describe what's going on, but they don't prescribe how you're supposed to move through this. Um, and finally, in terms of how it's helpful to me, I'm aware that we're not moving people to some stage. We're not helping them accomplish some plateau. Instead, we're supporting people as they're moving through this lifelong journey of identity formation. It's a learning process. If we can be present with people as they learn, rather than trying to move them to a point, will be way more helpful. Now, there is a growing pool of research that builds and tests and uses this model. I will include links to some of that research in the show notes. Studies through COVID helped validate the dual processes and helped understand why that season was so hard for grief. So thanks for joining me in this exploration of the model. Um, what I've realized in building this podcast and working on this newsletter and in doing my own work in walking people through grieving processes is how much of my thinking is building from this model. And I realized that I needed to create a place that I could point to and say, here's where to find the model. Look here. This will be a description of it so that you can understand what's going on inside my head as much as possible. So That's the reason for this episode. Thanks for listening to Finding Words in Hard Times, the podcast, where I'm providing stories and tools like this to help you be more comfortable as you help others in hard times. Make sure that you subscribed to the newsletter. Make sure that at This Is Hard .substack.com. Subscribe to either the YouTube podcast or to the podcast on Apple or Spotify. Um, check the show notes for links and resources. Finding Words in Hard Times is where you can find the best resource for the podcast itself. And thank you for being a helper. That's why you're here, and I'm grateful for that. Thanks for being part of this process in this community.